So the polis, as it were, is the name for the kind of city, the politic. Even to say the word politic, if you notice the word Poli, dealing with the same concept, dealing with the polity, the people. There were eventually over 1,000 polis in the Greek world, but among the most important were Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Syracuse, Aegina, Rhodes, Argos, Eretyra, and Elis. In there you might have recognized some of those names that you may have heard before. Athens, Corinth, the book of Corinthians in the Bible was written to those Christians in Corinth. So the biggest of all of the polis was Sparta, with some 8,500 kilometers squared of territory. It was exceptionally large, and typically most polis, most cities or whatever, would be small in size. So polis such as Athens, Rhodes, Syracuse possessed significant naval fleets, which allowed them to control wide areas of territory across the Aegean Sea. Though Sparta was the largest, the most infamous is Athens, right? You've all heard of Athens. One of the key cultural values of the Greek polis was the ideal of the rule of law. Greeks believed that citizens should obey not any one individual or group, but the laws, which embodied everything they considered good and just. So this was ideal, the ideal that actually made them different from the barbarians. So interesting, the origin of the term barbarian is basically anybody who wasn't Greek to the Greeks, though they would consider them barbarians. And as I was taught when I took Greek in my undergrad, the reason they called them barbarians is because when they spoke, they sounded like bar. So it was kind of a mockery to say, they're the barbarians. So the Greeks were different from the barbarians, who in their opinions were slaves to the kings, unrestrained by any laws. And so again, the part of the Greek polis was not about submitting to the king or the mayor of the town, as it were, if you will. It was about submitting to the law. The law itself was considered to be a kind of good, virtuous thing that should be honored, not necessarily those who enforce it or those who regulate it, but to look to the law itself as good and just. Each year, about 6,000 Athenians would, if they were over the age of 30, they were selected to decide cases in court, and they swore the judicial oath to vote in accordance with the laws and decrees of the Athenian people. And so part of what was important about these, this kind of society or this sort of government was that it was democratic in a sense that it gave people a voice. It allowed them to speak. In the late 5th century, the average Athenian probably served in the courts once every 6 or 7 years and heard dozens, if not hundreds of cases. Even without receiving formal training, most Athenians would therefore have acquired an extensive legal education. Issues of law were important to the Athenians, so no wonder democracy arises in Athens. People were given the opportunity to be heard and accepted or rejected. One such place where people were heard was in the Agora and in the Areopagus in Athens. The Agora would be a public place where you would go and debate issues of politics and religion and philosophy publicly. There's a movie, it's not a very historically accurate movie, but it's about an early ancient Greek philosopher and scientist, actually, and thinker named Hypatia, who many would attribute to being, killed by religion, and it's kind of used as kind of a piece of propaganda to say that religion and all of this, fake faith-believing kind of movement extinguished intellectualism, and we can see this in the life of Hypatia. But anyway, in the Agora, they would stand out in the public square. So you ever see the movie, at least some of the setting, the ideas and the concepts there are quite accurate. And you see them arguing, debating publicly. But again, since we're talking about the Greeks, and one of the best sources for understanding Greek culture and, reliable, I would say, source of historical documentation would be to look to the book of Acts again. In Acts 17, we have Paul at the Areopagus, which is this place where he goes and he speaks, and it's actually on the hill, the Pagos of Ares, who is the god of war. So we have the Areopagus, the hill of Ares. And so if you've ever read anywhere in Acts 17, maybe particularly kind of highlighting in Acts 17:30, Paul gets up and he says, "Truly these times of ignorance God has overlooked, but is now calling all men to repentance." And he makes this declaration to the Greeks that even you need to repent. And that's important because Paul had a Greek formal education, but he was Jewish through and through. He brags about his Jewishness, but he was, from Tarsus, which was a very Greek place, and he was educated. He actually, in Acts 17, quotes a Stoic philosopher. And so Paul knew his Greek culture and philosophy quite well. He paid attention in his humanities class, if you will. But the Areopagus was the name of a committee, originally so called because it met as a kind of court on the hill. So it wasn't like Paul was just kind of hanging out. He went to a very important place and made some very important declarations about what he believed concerning this Jesus of Nazareth. And he goes to the Areopagus and he makes some very bold claims. But every city of any importance had an agora and an acropolis, but only Athens had the Areopagus. So Paul speaks specifically in that selection text to the Stoics and the Epicureans, which we will talk about the Stoics and the Epicureans as well in this class. So back to the polis though. In his Politics, as it's called, Aristotle described politics and the Athenian polis as the partnership finally composed of several villages is the polis, is what he says. It has at least attained the limit of virtually complete self-sufficiency, which is important to freedom and important to democracy, and thus, while it comes into existence for the sake of mere life, it exists for the sake of the good life. And that term, the good life, is important and very specific to Aristotle. And it's the Greek word eudaimonia, which literally means the good life. And so it is the ancient Greek version of living the dream, right? LTD. So let's see here. Let me give it to you. Eudaimonia in the Greek. Eudaimonia. I don't have any of my little accents and different little ticks and things on the words, mostly because I don't know them all by memory, but they weren't there actually. We added those later in order to help us pronounce the words. So this would be more true. In fact, most ancient Greek was written Koine Greek, or depending on classical Greek, it doesn't matter, but a lot of it was written in just all caps, block lettering, with no spacing. And you just sort of had to figure it out. So very complicated to read and interpret ancient Greek manuscripts. But eudaimonia, which eu comes from the prefix for like good. If you were to read someone's eulogy, right, you're giving like a good word, a logos, and good word for that person's life. Eugenics, not a great example, but to say there are good genes and there are bad genes, that appeals to that word, EU. But daimonia is also, strangely enough, is the place we get the word for like a demon, an indwelling. So life. the good life. Anyway, it's kind of an interesting stretch there in the etymology in the ancient Greek. But for Aristotle, the highest good is the end for the sake of which everything else is chosen. And what that means is, everything you do is to to appeal to that highest good. The highest human good is happiness. Aristotle was very much so committed to, you're living a good life if you're happy. Living your best life now, if you will. Happiness is the principle and cause of goods, is what Aristotle proclaimed. The human good is the activity of the rational soul in accordance with the excellence in a complete life. Now, whether participation in the polis in terms of political participation is the only form of participation that Aristotle envisages to satisfy this idea of eudaimonia is a matter of some debate. If the polis is viewed purely as a political entity, then obviously the participation in self-fulfillment of eudaimonia can only be through political participation. So there's this thought that you can't be happy and living the good life unless you are participating in politics, which really, I would think that kind of like saying, if you're not voicing your democratic opinion, if you're not taking part in making known your needs, then you're not being expressed, and that's going to detract from the good life. So the good life would be partially being able to make your vote. And if we really kind of make the stretch, it's to say, part of why free countries are so awesome is that people are free and they get to have a say, they get to participate. I think though it was Mark Twain who said that if voting was important, they wouldn't let us do it. So, anyway, some people may have a more cynical view on the freedom we have in this country, but you at least get to go to the voters booth and make your statement and say, I want this person, I don't want this, I like this law, I don't like that law. Now, whether or not in the end you're just a drop in the bucket, who knows? But Aristotle would say in a philosophical sense, participation in the polis, participation in the government would kind of, be part of this eudaimonia, this good life. Another conception of eudaimonia is an activity whereby individuals get their act together to be completely moral and intellectual beings. And so, and there's some common sense there. I think it's not too deep of a philosophy to think that, if you live a moral life and you are an intellectual person, you're virtuous and you're going to live a better, happier existence if you are striving for the ultimate good. Because if you're striving for virtue, then you're going to be happier. If you're participating in society, you're going to be happier, more so than if you are withdrawn. So we have Aristotle, and then we have Socrates. In 399 BCE, Socrates was executed by the Athenian court on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. He was actually accused of blasphemy, blaspheming the gods and leading children astray. In one sense, that many believe that is quite a trumped up charge and difficult to prove, but nonetheless, he faces a trial of sorts where he is executed, but he willfully gives in to drinking poison and he dies. So the controversial decision lingers atop the great legacy of Athens, a city praised for its intellectual and political liberty. However, the reasons behind Socrates' execution are themselves questionable. Firstly, the charge of impiety is a vague accusation which would have been unlikely to produce a conviction on its own. Similarly, the second charge of corrupting the youth is ambiguous and lacks any substantial evidence in support of it. Instead, a primary cause of the execution is Socrates' relationship with two violent oligarchic tyrants. So, in this sense, it was a matter of who Socrates kept as company that were considered politically undesirable to the people who held his fate in his hand. And so, in the instability of Athens in the wake of the oligarchic coup of 404 BCE amplifies the desire to eliminate sources of dissent, such as people like Socrates. Thus, Socrates' execution by the Athenians is not caused by the explicit charges of impiety and corrupting the youth, but rather by implicit political motivations which come to a head in 399 BCE. So as your textbook states, Socrates' willingness to submit to the process and not flee was an indication of his belief in the polis. So while he may not have agreed with the people attempting to enforce the law, he was willing to submit to the process and subject himself to the proceeding that could ultimately end in his death, and it does. So, just interesting to say that, the submission to the law and the submission to the process of the polis and the way that the government and the society was ran was so important that Socrates was willing to die for it. But just to say a little bit here about the history of Greek philosophy and science, we're going to kind of rewind and go back to the pre-Socratics, which would have been the thinkers that would have come before before Socrates. So the pre-Socratics were 6th and 5th century BCE Greek thinkers who introduced a new way of inquiring into the world and the place of human beings in it. They were recognized in antiquity as the first philosophers and scientists of the Western tradition. So, as their name tells, they're pre-Socratic, so before Socrates. Popular amongst the pre-Socratics would be Pythagoras. Now you've heard of Pythagoras, right? He is the man we attribute with the a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? So the Pythagorean theorem. But more importantly than that, I would say Pythagoras, his discovery of music is very much so, I would think, one of the most powerfully contributing concepts in Western culture. And as the tradition goes, Pythagoras is walking by a metalworking shop and he hears these hammers clanging on steel or whatever metals they're pounding out at the time. And he hears these sounds and he begins to notice that each sound has a frequency, it has a pitch, it has a tone, it has, these different sounds. And he begins to kind of collect them in a sense, and from there he develops this theory that some sounds harmonize with others based on different degrees. And so when you make a chord, like on a guitar, you're playing 6 separate notes most of the time, and those 6 separate notes, they all harmonize for a mathematical reason. And so another interesting thing about Pythagoras was that he wasn't actually, he probably didn't do the things we say he did. What I mean by that is he kind of led a cult, and they believed in, anyway, I think I'll get into this in another lecture, but they believed in the one, and they believed in sort of this kind of golden mean idea, and I might be kind of, not handling that topic well because I don't have my notes with me, but I'll just say this. Many look back and say Pythagoras led a cult, and many of the things that are attributed to Pythagoras were actually carried out and accomplished by the people in his school. So so there's a little bit about Pythagoras, but I'm pretty sure he comes up later, and I'll address that in another lecture. But the sophists, they're important as philosophers because the Greek, for one, sophist literally comes from the word we have for wisdom in the Greek. And so Sophia means wisdom. Also from the goddess Sophia, right? The goddess of wisdom, which would, in that case, we'd give her a capital S, a capital sigma. Sophia, right? And so if you add Philos, and Sophia, you get the love of wisdom. So the sophists, their name is taken from Sophia, which means wisdom. So essentially, the sophists were into wisdom, into learning, in a general sense, ones who exercised wisdom or learning. And Sophia could designate specific types of expertise, as well as general sagacity in the conduct of life, or sagacity would be, I guess, the way you'd say that. They were sage-like. In the way that the sophists would conduct their life, they were kind of set apart. They would conduct, their affairs in a very sage or expert kind of wandering, wise person would. In the course of the 5th century BCE, the term, while retaining its original unspecific sense, came in addition to be applied specifically to a new type of intellectuals, professional educators, who toured the Greek world offering instruction in a wide range of subjects with particular emphasis on skill in public speaking and the successful conduct of life. And again, I like to think of these guys as kind of like the rock stars. They toured, they traveled around, and they tried to encourage people to develop their public speaking skills. They were orators. They were, they believed in the art of rhetoric and, persuading people with your words and encouraging people to get on board with their philosophical viewpoints and how to live their best life, how to conduct life, how to be a good person, in an Aristotelian sense, how to engage in the eudaimonia, how to live the good life, your best life now. The emergence of this new profession, which was an extension to new areas of the tradition of the itinerant rhapsody, which were the wandering, traveling rock stars, as I think of people who went around reciting poems, especially Homer's poems, was a response to various social, economic, political, and cultural developments of the period. Okay, so you had the increasing wealth and intellectual sophistication of Greek cities, especially Athens, and this created a demand for higher education beyond the traditional basic grounding in literacy, arithmetic, music, and physical training. So to some extent, this involved the popularization of Ionian speculation about the physical world, pre-Socratic philosophy, for example, which was extended into areas such as history, geography, and the origins of civilization. So the increase in this participatory democracy, especially in Athens, led to a demand for success in political and forensic oratory, and hence the development of specialized techniques of persuasion and argument. Popular among the sophists would be, for one, Protagoras, not to be confused with Pythagoras, but Protagoras, and he believed man is the measure of all things. This would have been an example of early humanism. Man is the end-all, be-all. The most important thing is man. Not, where some belief would say that gods are most important, man is most important. That would be the early humanistic thinking. So Socrates did not like the sophists at all, except for their oratory skills, because Socrates was very big on speaking. In fact, he may not have written a thing, but he talked a lot. So he was a speaker. Plato comes in after Socrates, was a student of Socrates, and actually did write something, whereas Socrates didn't write anything. On the one hand, Plato was an idealist, and this is kind of complicated, so I don't want to lose you. But Plato was an idealist, meaning that the only reality, as he saw it, is in the ideal world. And so this would be the world of ideas. Not down here where we are, but the world of ideas. It's that view that there is no external reality composed of matter and energy. There are only ideas existing within minds. It's kind of a futile way to see the world, but anyway. It is most of all from Plato that we get the theory of forms, according to which the world we knew through the senses is only an imitation of the pure, the eternal, the unchanging world of the forms. Aristotle, just to give you a little bit on him, and then we'll hit some concluding remarks, but Aristotle, I didn't tell you, but he was born 384, lived to 322 BCE, was from Macedonia, a northern region of the Greek world where his father served as a court physician to the local king. As a young man, Aristotle traveled to Athens to study under Plato at the academy, and he remained there until Plato's death. He did not believe in forms, okay? He believed in causes, which are what we would think of as internal forces that shape the material world. And again, this is dense philosophical stuff, so I'm not going to go into it too deep. Aristotle took the Platonic forms out of the transcendental realm and put them into the very material world that made up an object or a living thing. So he took it all from this ideal place and put it here in reality. As I told you before, Aristotle wrote tremendously. I mean, he wrote on every topic you could imagine. He was a philosopher, he was a rhetorician. In fact, the art of rhetoric as we know it, we can attribute to mostly, I mean, in many ways we can attribute to other, later philosophers, but Aristotle's a big one. So when you talk about logos, pathos, and ethos, that was Aristotle. In fact, you'll do an exercise later on when we talk about the Reformation. You will analyze Martin Luther's speech before the Diet of Worms, and you will look for logos, pathos, and ethos. But that is taken from an Aristotelian concept of rhetoric. So Aristotle, he talked about, rhetoric. He wrote on logic. He was a biologist. He was a physicist. He was a cosmologist. Aristotle had an interesting kind of cosmology that really stayed in place as the way people thought the world existed for the better part of 2,000 years. But it was earth, water, air, fire, and the celestial region. So you had, let's see if I can draw that for you really quickly. Earth, water, fire, and the celestial realm. And so down here you have earth, you have water, fire, and the celestial realm. So this is earth, water, fire, and then the heavens, the celestial realm. And so for a long time, people thought in these senses. They thought we've got water in the atmosphere, we've got fire beyond that, which is in the heavens, and then if you move beyond all of that, you're going to end up in the celestial realm. So why did science and philosophy develop in ancient Greece? That's a good question to ask, but I'm going to give you 5 reasons why, and then I'm going to close. For one, there was a high degree of wealth, and that was very important because it provided the time to sit around and be a philosopher and to think and to study, literature, music. And so the opportunity of being wealthy and successful allowed for folks to sit around and think deeply. The possession of relatively advanced technologies in agriculture, seafaring, and navigation, poetry, textile manufacturing, and metallurgy. They had all the technology they needed to succeed. And so the third is that they had an understanding of many other cultures as a consequence of their Greek geography and trade. They had a high literacy rate. They had the development of democratic and oligarchic city-states, which fostered high regard for reasoning and rhetoric among citizens. And so let me give you one more. They also had a lot of slaves. And so they had more slaves than they had citizens, so they had a lot of people to do the work for them. So we'll close on that, but that is the lecture for the Greeks.